Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitik Survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to this new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Lokendra, a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at Takshashila. Now, when I say AI, what is the most popular thing that comes to your mind? Most likely, it is ChatGPT, developed and deployed by OpenAI. Or maybe you would have heard Google's Gemini and Anthropic's Claude. You might have used either one of them or some of them by now. But did you notice that most of your interactions with these applications would have been in English? Now, why is that the case? The thing is, LLMs generally do not work that well with non English languages. So, in addition to the fact that a lot of us do interact with these applications in English, there is also the fact that these models, when deployed in non English languages, do not give accurate responses. What does this mean? What does this mean for India, a country which has 22 languages recognized by the constitution, and there are hundreds of languages according to different estimates spoken in the country? How do we build and deploy LLMs for Indian languages in such a case? Or should we even do so? To discuss these pertinent issues, I have with me Adya and Anwesha. Adya works as a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at Takshashila. She has written in Deccan Herald in 10 December on India's LLM challenge, and Anwesha is an assistant program manager with Takshashila's policy school and has been researching on AI and LLMs. So I'll first start with Anwesha. Can you please explain to our listeners what these LLMs are and how do they differ from other types of AI?
Right. Thank you, Lokendra. So large language models, or LLMs, are considered as generative AI. This is different from discriminative AI. So we can consider these two categories for the purpose of this conversation. Generative AI essentially creates new content based on the input data. So these models are trained on vast amounts of training data and are trained to recognize patterns. So based on the user's input, they're able to predict, in some sense, what comes next, essentially. So large language models are textual in nature, and they use machine learning techniques to learn from training data. The other type of AI, which is discriminative AI, can categorize and distinguish data to make predictions. So some examples there would be image classification, facial recognition technologies, also softwares which have now been deployed in traffic signals to recognize car number plates. So those sort of use cases generally use discriminative AI. And then there's other forms of generative AI also, which generate not just text, but also images, videos, audios, etc.
Thanks, Anvesha, for that answer. Adya, what are multimodal AI? Something that you've also written in your Deccan Herald article about.
So I think the answer lies in the name itself. You go back to large language models. LLMs are trained on a large volume of textual data. But now sometimes you think if we went beyond merely text, there's so many things we could do with the same technology, and that's where multimodal LLMs come in, where they use multiple forms of input and output data, which isn't just restricted to text, but can also be in the forms of audio, images. And I think that completely widens the horizons of what you can do with AI. Now, for example, take ChatGPT 4 and you'll see the evolution from the first model of the AI. Originally, ChatGPT could just have text based outputs. But today, you can see AI based artworks based on prompts that are given to models like ChatGPT that then can create these very, very sophisticated artwork. Google Labs, also, for example, has this experiment where it's basically focused on prompt engineering, where you have to come up with a prompt and then it generates an image. And I think that gives you a sense of the depth and the breadth of the capabilities of multimodal LLMs, where not only can they function and operate on these different forms of inputs, but they can also have intuitive understanding based on the inputs that you provide it with, which are often quite sophisticated.
Thanks, Adya, for that response. Let me do a follow up question with you. Now, we have set the background on what LLMs are, how do they differ from other types of AI, and you have very patiently explained what multimodal LLMs are. So, let me ask you, what is the current landscape in India when it concerns LLMs in non English languages?
So I think when we look at non-English language LLMs, we have to take in account what the English language LLM, the primarily English language LLMs can do in that sphere. I'll give you an anecdotal example of my experience with ChatGPT. A friend of mine was moving house and wanted to translate some land records from Kerala into English because obviously she couldn't understand them because they were A, very old, and B, very complex. And she fed it into ChatGPT, and the answer we got seemed like it knew what it was talking about. But then when we run that by someone who's fluent in the language, we realized that there was a lot of contextual understanding missing. And I think because of that gap in data, people feel like there's a need for there to be Indian language LLMs. But the problem faced by Indian companies is the same as these larger international companies. It's a lack of data, right? So while we have startups and while we have some companies working with India AI to develop Indian language LLMs, there's still a lot to do. Because in addition to just building models that are capable of functioning with these inputs, we also have to have enough data to train them on for them to be successful and effective.
Thanks, Adya. Let me ask you another question, right? In your Deccan Herald article on India's LLM challenge that appeared on 10th December, you have made a point that, you know, there are some use cases for LLMs in Indian languages, for instance, education, healthcare, financial services, and so on. But are there any other use cases that you foresee?
See, I think once these capabilities have been developed, they're not going to be limited to any few sectors. Like, for example, India has a lot of literature in regional languages and many, many different dialects. And often we aren't able to translate it into English or Hindi or Tamil or Telugu or any of the popular languages that are more widely used because there's a lack of people who are capable of doing that translation, and B, you have to manually sift through all of that material. Now, if we were to have Indian language LLMs that were fluent with these different scripts and languages and also the context, then we could translate a huge corpus of literature which is otherwise going to be lost. Or let me give you another very, very different example. Like I was giving you the anecdote of a friend of mine. Any number of legal documents and proceedings could be translated into regional languages, which would A, make them more accessible for people who are living in those regions who aren't fluent in English. And B, it would make it easier for these proceedings to take place. Because I think a lot is lost in the fact that people are not able to understand the English language, especially in tech.
Thanks, Adya. So let me move to Anvesha now. Anvesha, so Adya argued that there are, certain use cases for LLMs in India in non-English languages, especially when it comes to preserving age-old traditions, right, and translating these things. Now, do you concur with her, or do you think there are use cases beyond this as well?
So when we talk about use cases, there's obviously an infinite number of things that can be done with this technology as it continues to develop at a very fast pace. But one thing that we need to keep in mind is opportunity cost. So the more use cases that we develop, we also need to keep in mind how many people that's actually helping. And while having Indic language models have use cases wherein you can translate between English and other Indian languages, is quite important. It's also important to note that this is very resource intensive. And a lot of the data that we have in Indian languages is not available in a digital space. A lot of it is handwritten, a lot of it is not in a readable format, which can then be scraped for training the AI. So, those are some considerations to keep in mind while companies or even governments develop these large language models. But I do concur, as in, we need to have some LLMs in Indian languages for the use of the Indian populace, and it's definitely something that's quite high up on the agenda in terms of us as a nation as well. But yeah, so it's important to also consider the resources that will be put into this, the costs that will go into this, and the time taken. It's not something that can happen at a very fast pace. Yeah, I think that's where I stand on this.
Yeah, there.
I actually have a question for Anwesha because this is something I've been thinking about. Given the resource constraints as well as the time constraints and the fact that there's many other things governments have to focus on, does it make more sense to enhance the capabilities of already existing LLMs, which are often belonging to corporations that have much more resources at their hands? Or does it make sense to develop indigenous Indian language LLMs? Because that also requires the research brains that I think we don't have as many as we need. We have a dearth of. So which makes more sense?
I think popularly, even Nandan Nilekani mentioned this in multiple places, where India should rather focus on use cases than building foundational models. While it is important for us as Indians to have the capabilities to build foundational models for use cases which may not essentially require that much of resource and time to be spent on them, it may be an easier way out to consider just building on existing models. That saves time, saves resources. You don't need as much human involvement in the same. So in that case, I would say preferably building use cases on existing models works. But on the other hand, we should also parallelly develop our skills in developing foundational models.
Just to see if I understand correctly, you're saying in the long run, it does make sense to enhance our own technological capabilities.
Yeah.
But to deal with present issues and solve for some of these constraints that we have, it makes more sense to build on these already existing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Anvesha, while you're answering, you briefly mentioned about data sets and the lack of digitized data sets for Indian languages. I was going to come to that later when we would have discussed the challenges, but let us drive into that right away. Uh, how do LLMs do reasoning? How do LLMs arrive at these answers? I remember some time back you did work on reasoning in LLMs and made a presentation also. So can you explain to our listeners why is data set so important for a good data set so important for an LLM to reason properly?
So the first thing to consider there is LLMs can't, or whatever the foundational model is, can't distinguish between the quality of the data. So they don't know if, I mean, it's not a person, but it doesn't know whether it's good data or bad data. So it depends on the data that the developers are feeding into the model. What matters here is the quantity of data. So the more a certain type of data exists in the training data, the more the model will be well trained on that particular type of data. So that's the first thing to consider. And then when we're talking about LLM reasoning, so I would put reasoning in double quotes because obviously it's not actually able to reason. What it does is pattern recognition. So it essentially, whatever input you've used, it will predict what is likely to come after that particular input prompt that you've used. So the main thing that an LLM does is pattern recognition. It is built on the foundations of statistics and probability and those sort of concepts. And so what we consider to be reasoning is just the LLMs having been trained on huge amounts of data, and whatever, usually the prompts that we use are something that may have been used in some online resource, some website or social media, and so it's able to pick up from that training data and formulate something that looks like a human like response. But when you delve a bit deeper into it, you can see that, for example, if you use math questions to test whether an LLM can mathematically reason, what is seen is most of the times it's not able to. And these are the state of the art models. So the more better known ChatGPT, Gemini, etc. They're not able to accurately, not all the time accurately predict the answer of the question. If you change the numbers in a math question, for example, the answer accuracy also changes. Even if you change the names or other variables, the answers change. And same goes for other logic reasoning questions. And so it's important to consider what these models are built for, what the use case is, and to not generalize these models in being able to do anything and everything. So keeping in mind the use case that a certain language model is built for is something that's important when we're also auditing, or it's important to consider as users as well as developers to not generalize the model.
So, Anvesha, if I understand you correctly, the main problem at the crux of this is the lack of data sets in Indian languages on which we can train foundational models on. Is that correct
Yes,
understanding of the
yes.
issue?
So for Indian language models, that is a very core issue wherein the data sets primarily don't really exist on the internet. And so for one example, if you take the contextual, like the anecdote that Adya shared earlier, for example, ChatGPT and other such models are also trained on data from, say, social media, Reddit, and other such forums, which are primarily used by a certain sector of society. It's predominantly, say, male populations belonging to the US or maybe Europe, English speakers, etc., etc. So there's not a lot of local Indians who use such platforms. Now, if the data is coming from there, it gets magnified in the sense that, like I mentioned, LLMs use the quantity of data. That's the main focus. And so when the quantity of data from in Indian languages is less, it is obviously more likely to be less trained on such data sets.
Thanks, Anvesha. We'll move to Adya now. Adya, what are some government initiatives in this field currently? Is Ministry of Information Technology doing something about it?
So, first of all, we have this initiative called India AI, and I think the budget breakdown for that came out recently. Where, correct me if I'm wrong, I think like 1,000 crores have been allocated to it, a section of which are also going to be used to develop Indian language LLM. And in the India AI mission, there have been collaborations between the government and private sector and startups as well. And there are a few examples of Indian language LLMs which have been developed. I think despite these government initiatives, what we go back to is the issue of data, which crops up again and again and again. Like Anwesha said, first of all, it's the sheer quantum of data. But secondly, it's also the diversity of data. And even where there is data available, I think it's not diverse enough to be able to come up with models which would be able to operate without bias and understand context. So I don't think a lack of government initiatives is the issue here.
So, let's say in a hypothetical scenario when we had a long frame of time to implement this, we would have ideally done it sequentially. We would have first digitized
Yeah.
Indian languages as much as possible. We would have encouraged people who speak lesser known languages to come to internet, interact in their own languages. So we'll first make the internet multilingual, so to speak. We'll digitize all the books. We'll digitize every written thing in every language, right? Hundreds of them. And then after that is done to a reasonable extent, we will then build foundational models. I mean, if we had that long term mindset and the luxury of long term thing, we would have gone this way. But now we are talking about innovations at breaking speed, and so rightfully we have that data issue. We are not focusing enough on digitization or making the internet multilingual very quickly, or even reducing the digital gap, right? Connectivity gap. So thanks for illuminating that aspect. So Adya, I'll do a follow-up question with you. So you talked about government of India having a certain fund on AI and stuff. So do you think the government should even be bothered about AI, should be bothered about building LLMs, or should it leave it entirely to the private sector? I mean, the government has challenges in the education, healthcare sector. These are physical infrastructure challenges which require physical money to go in to build physical infrastructure. Isn't going for digital solutions too easy a solution, sort of a window dressing?
I actually think going for digital solutions ends up being a harder solution because a lot of the time people think it's a quick fix, especially because there's this fear of being left behind as other countries are much more advanced in some of these areas. But I do think it's more important to combat issues such as education and healthcare first. I think when a country is in a place where these basic issues have been addressed, then it makes much more sense to focus on these long term technological solutions. And I don't think India is there right now, but I also understand that as a government, you have constraints where you feel like you have to develop these technologies parallelly. So then I think within the resources India has, we have to figure out how these technologies can be developed in a manner that is effective. Like, I don't know if giving money to build Indian language LLMs is the answer, for example.
Thanks, Adya. Anwesha, do you concur with Adya on this?
Yes, largely I do concur. One more thing to consider would be, so you took the example of healthcare. So us being residents in a tier one city, we're used to largely digitized healthcare platforms and medicine delivery systems and all of that. But when you move into tier two, tier three cities or rural areas in India, which is where the majority of the population lives, a lot of this is done either on WhatsApp or just physical pieces of paper. Record keeping is in that sort of in those sort of modes, and so there you're also losing out on data. And so the healthcare LLMs or other AI models that are being built to diagnose diseases, for example, a lot of these diseases are very localized. They depend on the regional context, the geographical context, the lifestyles of these people. And so all of that data is being missed out. And then when you deploy such models on people who are not necessarily belonging to the same context, there's a higher chance of false positives, false negatives, wrong diagnoses, and a whole range of risks. Which once the genie is out of the bottle, it's quite difficult to control. So I definitely agree that education, healthcare, and these sort of sectors need to be developed first. And we already have quite a few startups and other private companies that are actively building in this space. So my suggestion would be of for the government to rather focus on developing other healthcare infrastructure and education infrastructure first, and then sort of maybe collaborating in public private partnerships to then deploy these models more effectively.
Thanks, Anvesha, for that nuanced take on this. So you spoke about the private sector, right? And why private sector might be more suited to do these things. And Adya, in your Deccan Herald piece, again, you have mentioned some of the private sector initiatives. So can you tell them to our listeners what these initiatives are and how they are faring?
So we have multiple companies who have private sector initiatives. For example, we have Tech Mahindra's Indus 2.0 and we have Co-Rover AI's Bharat GPT. And then we have many, many other sector specific models that have been built. But I think it comes down to the same issues that we've discussed already with the rest of the conversation we've had, because while these exist, they don't have enough data. And since there's not enough permeation of data, and since especially in rural India, there's not enough digital penetration as well for there to be data, it comes back to the same thing.
So, Anvesha, what is your view on private sector's role? I mean, you did argue bad for private sector to play a leading role in this, but are they doing enough?
I think one of the key issues with private sector taking over, and I think this would be a general issue across anyone building these models, is we need to consider where their data comes from. Again, we're going back to the question of data, and also what sort of nuances the developers are considering, because we also need to take into account that the developers also belong to a certain specific sector of society. They have certain backgrounds and context to how they are building the models, and that often leaves out, say, gender bias issues or other sorts of discriminatory issues which can creep into these models. So it's important for developers, whether they're private or from the government, to consider these nuances and to build in risk mitigation strategies into the model itself. AI broadly is a socio-technological sort of phenomenon wherein it vastly has a huge impact on society itself. And it's also a technology, but you can't really fix it with just having good technology. You need to take into account the social aspects of it. So, I mean, private sector will obviously be developing AI. There's no point in either blocking it or regulating it in that sense. Obviously, there should be regulations for the safety of the users. But as private sector continues to develop these use cases, they need to be made aware of risk mitigation, strategies, and also have maybe guidelines around how this can be done. And because a lot of folks in the startup ecosystem, for example, are not quite aware of what are the exact sort of risks that can crop up in specific use cases and specific models. And so there needs to be that sort of education among developers as well. And then broadly speaking, also that sort of education among users who may not be that well versed with the digital space.
On the role of the private sector, I'd also like to add something. While I completely agree with you that this is something they've been working on to an extent and all of that, I think one of the other roadblocks is that it's just Indian language LLMs just aren't as lucrative a market as, let's say, an English LLM, because Indian language LLMs at the end of the day are going to be restricted to India by and large, negating all the Indians abroad who are also fluent in English. So I think because of this, there has to be something to incentivize private players to want to have a piece of this market in the first place, because at the end of the day it just financially makes more sense for them to be part of a market which is likely to bring in more profits for them.
True.
And I think that's where we come back to the issue of whether the government should have a role to play, and if yes, what it should be.
Thanks, Anwesha and Adya. Let's take a step back from data, from private sector, from government sector. Let's come back to global LLMs, primarily English language, right? And one of the consistent challenges they have been facing for the last couple of years has been content moderation, right? Has been on putting effective guardrails to minimize risk and harms. And Anvesha, you have someone who has, is very passionate about human rights, who's passionate about minimizing these risks and harms. Now, if English language LLMs with so much training data sets and manpower and resources, with ethics teams, with legal teams, and many teams, and they put thousands of people in there, they're struggling with content moderation. They're struggling with minimizing the risk. Right? How do we do it for Indian LLMs? Right? You have so many languages here. Let's say if one company or a private player, or maybe government, or in and private sector in a public private partnership, anyone comes up with, let's say, a language model LLM in uh, let's say Gujarati, right? How do you ensure that you are able to dedicate ample resources, and when I say resources, I mean economic and also human resources, to ensure these guardrails are in place and risks are minimized? How do you do that?
So that's quite a tough question, which, as you rightly mentioned, even English large language models and deployers are struggling with. So there are, to broadly maybe categorize content moderation into hallucinations and bias. Just very broadly, there are other types of risks as well. There are certain mitigation strategies that can be put in place from day one. So one would be expert in the loop system design, wherein you have humans who are experts in the subject matter, say doctors for healthcare, or agricultural experts for agri-tech use cases, who would be reviewing the subject matter that is being used for training these LLMs, and constantly sort of improving the content quality. Then there are technical methods such as retrieval augmented generation and fine tuning, which can be used to improve context specific outputs from the LLMs. There's other ways in which you can constantly feed feedback to the LLMs by marking certain answers as right or wrong, or improving on the quality of the answers. And this can also be a part of, say, auditing and other such. So it's a continuous process. It's not that you develop an LLM, you deploy it, and then you're done with it. It's a iterative process wherein you have to keep improving the content that is outputted. You need to keep looking for different types of biases that can crop up. You can have bias metrics, and then you test the data sets or the language models against them. You can even consider building small language models instead of large language models, which would have a more specific use case and more specific sort of type of outputs that it would be used for. So those are some ways in which some of these, risks can be mitigated. And so not everything needs to be a large language model. You can have very specific, very contextual models as well, which would then perform a lot more better on comparatively smaller amounts of data.
So, Anwesha, one thing that appears to me from what you said is this requires a lot of money. Right?
Yes.
Money as well as people.
Yes.
Right. So, one big challenge, in addition to lack of data, for Indian LLMs to emerge is how do they deploy enough resources to have these strong safeguards in place. Right? That is one challenge, which is, Adya, would you agree?
I
Is it a big
completely
challenge?
agree with you, but I think it's not an easy fix. Like, it's not a question that we could answer on a podcast, simply because I think these are the issues that policymakers in the country are grappling with. Because given that we have so many other issues, like you rightly said earlier, we have healthcare and education to deal with, and especially given our data constraints, it's hard to, even in situations where we're able to deploy enough funds like the India AI mission, it's hard to build such models even in those cases. And that's still a best case scenario. So I think this is just a constant problem that needs to be addressed, but it's a much more long-term issue.
Sure. Anvesha, I'll ask you a very simple sort of, stupid question. Why can't we simply use English LLMs and then translate the responses to other languages? Why can't we do that? I mean, as long as you understand the grammatical structure of other languages and feed it to some sort of model, right? So you do everything back end in English, your, let's say, chat GPT or any other thing, and then the response that it gives, you just translate it to other languages. And the input also it takes, you take it in the other, regional language, translate it to English. Why can't we do that?
So there, you mentioned grammar. So I would say that a lot of, say, the grammatical rules or the language that we consider to be, so for example, I'm Bengali. So the Bengali that I speak at home, I don't know how to read and write, is very different from the Bengali I would read on, say, a website or a book. So there's a lot of dialectical differences. There's even grammar being a more of a social construct. There's a difference there as well. And so, since a lot of these Indic language models are primarily for people who don't know English, the problem is there, wherein if there are differences in the context, if the translations are not fully accurate, and like Adya also mentioned in her anecdote, if it misses out on those contexts, it's not that helpful for, say, a farmer or a patient in a tier 3 city who may not know how to speak English. It isn't that helpful for them. And so to just use a, I mean, what you're describing is essentially we can even use like Google Translate to do the same thing. But we've seen with Google Translate, it fares considerably better on European languages such as French, German, etc. But then it does quite worse on Indian languages. And even within Indian languages, it would be better on the 22 languages which are recognized. But then the other, hundreds of languages that we have, it probably does not have enough data. Even for, so for example, as we're all sitting in Bangalore, to use Google Translate for, Kannada, it sometimes isn't accurate. And so then when you're bringing that to a large language model level, it's likely to not fare well at all.
Thanks, Anvesha, for that. Let me ask you both whether what I'm about to say can work as a potential solution. Let's say we have bunch of people sitting in Ahmedabad and they want to build a community AI open source model. And what they're doing is they are literally scouting through their own Gujarati community, digitizing records, maybe not building foundational models, as you said, or maybe just building use cases, right? Fine tuning the other models and doing it in an open source way, in a collaborative way. Do you think such community models being nurtured by communities, emerging out of communities, as opposed to proprietary models or models made by governments, can work better for in the Indian scenario, given that we have so many languages, right?
So I have a question for you. Have you seen any examples of a community model that has worked though?
No, I don't think, I don't know of anyone, but there might be. There might be community models.
There are community models. At the top of my head, I can't remember the names, but there are models being developed in Telugu, in Kannada, I think even in Bengali, Gujarati, Hindi, though I am pretty sure is already there. And these are open source models, and they are developed collaboratively with the open source community that exists in India, which, might I add, is quite a vibrant community. And they have been actively developing these sort of models. And, the pros of engaging a community in this sort of activity is that you get a lot of that context, a lot of the nuances in each of these languages to become a part of that model. And not to mention that it not being proprietary already means that it's a much more transparent process. It's more collaborative. It's more, it takes into account all these different sort of risks that could emerge. And so obviously this is a much better, and maybe not as it may be resource intensive but not as money intensive in some sense, to build, collaboratively build such models.
Thanks, Anvesha, for that answer. No, I really think it also solves for one more problem. The tricky thing in India is the moment you come to the choosing inclusion and exclusion, right? The very idea that certain languages would have models, certain won't, right?
Yeah.
So if the private sector or the government does it, right, it will become such a contested issue as to which languages are included, which
Right.
languages are excluded. You may have people from very remote parts of the country saying, look, we are left out, right? And
Right.
why we are left out, right? We are also citizens of this country. So community open source models, right, to some extent solve this issue, right?
Yes.
If it emerges out from the community, then definitely every community can say, oh, we are going to build our models. And if the open source community in India, as you said, is very vibrant and can provide support to them, if the private sector can provide certain grants to these, and if the government can do some interventions there and nudge these, or change the incentive structure to make these mushroom and emerge, I mean that is a solution that could work.
Yeah, completely agree.
Like Adya and Anwesha, do we have agreement on that?
I think that would be great if it works, especially because one of the biggest issues with AI and large corporations is transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
And in an open source model, that would be mitigated.
Yeah.
Of course, there'd be issues of resource constraints, issues of manpower, all of that. But I think what we've come to agree on is in the case of any advancing technologies like AI, that will be there in any context.
Yeah.
So I think if open source communities are able to build models which also cater to their specific use cases, nothing like it.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'd like to leave our listeners with a question, and do think about this. Like, do a cost and benefit analysis of LLMs in Indian languages based on the conversation we have, and think whether the benefits outweigh the cost or not. And if they don't, then what should be our approach? And even if the benefits outweigh the cost, how do we tackle the challenges of data insufficiency, resource insufficiency, and so on? So thank you so much for listening in today.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.